The boardroom was completely silent. 23 executives, regional directors, and department heads sat around that long mahogany table, and not a single one of them made a sound. The kind of silence that fills a room when something massive is about to happen, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Vanessa Holloway, the CEO's niece, freshly minted VP of Strategic Operations, had just finished her 40-minute presentation. She was glowing, literally glowing, standing at the head of the table in a tailored charcoal blazer, clicker in one hand, a triumphant smile spreading across her face like she had just conquered something ancient and immovable. The board applauded, not politely. They genuinely applauded. 3 of them stood up. And the entire time, every single minute of her presentation, she had been talking about my work, my strategy, my numbers, my 18 months of quietly building something that nobody in that room fully understood yet. Except she had reframed every calculated decision I had made as a catastrophic error that she had heroically discovered and corrected. I sat at the far end of that table. I didn't clap, I didn't frown, I didn't shift in my seat or whisper to the colleague beside me. I just sat there, completely still with my hands folded on the table in front of me, because I had been waiting for this exact moment for 4 months. And when Vanessa finally sat down, flushed with victory, I raised one finger and asked for the floor. The CEO, her uncle, Richard Holloway, nodded, probably expecting me to concede gracefully, to acknowledge her brilliance, to make this transition smooth. Instead, I asked one question. One quiet, specific, devastatingly precise question about a revenue filter that Vanessa had accidentally deleted from the master dataset 3 weeks ago. And that's when Richard Holloway's face turned completely white. Something worth mentioning, this channel is just a handful of subscribers away from 1,000. These stories take real work to find and tell properly. If the work shows, subscribing is the most direct way to say so, and to make sure the next story finds its way to you. My name is Lauren Ashby. At the time of this story, I was the Director of Revenue Intelligence at Holloway & Crane Consulting, a mid-sized but rapidly growing firm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, that specialized in financial restructuring for mid-market companies going through mergers and acquisitions. I had worked my way into that role over 6 years, not because anyone handed it to me, not because I knew the right people at the right dinner parties. I grew up in Greensboro, not in poverty, not in struggle, but in a household where my father worked 31 years as a plant operations manager and my mother ran the administrative office of a pediatric clinic. We were comfortable, we were stable, but we were never the kind of family that called in favors or leveraged last names. What I understood from a very young age was that people who do the actual work are often the last ones celebrated for it. My father used to say that the floor manager gets the complaint and the executive gets the bonus. He wasn't bitter about it. He said it the way someone describes weather, as a fact of life worth understanding, not resenting. I carried that with me. I carried it through my finance degree at UNC Chapel Hill, through my first 3 jobs where I learned how organizations actually function versus how they claim to function, through my rise at Holloway & Crane, where I built a reputation for being the person who could look at a company's financial architecture and find exactly where the structure was quietly bleeding. I was known for being calm. Some people read that as passive. That was always their first mistake. I want to take you back to the beginning of all this. Not the boardroom, not the applause, not the question that changed everything, but to a Tuesday morning in late January, 18 months before that presentation happened. That was the day I first understood what I was actually dealing with. Vanessa Holloway joined Holloway & Crane in January of that year. Her title was Senior Strategy Consultant, which was a polite way of saying that Richard had created a position specifically for her after she spent 2 years at a boutique advisory firm in Atlanta that, as far as anyone could trace, had given her middling reviews and eventually restructured her role out of existence. She was smart. I want to be clear about that, because this story isn't about incompetence. It's actually more complicated than that. Vanessa Holloway was genuinely intelligent. She had good instincts about people. She could read a room. She knew how to make an idea sound exciting. What she lacked was the patience that real strategy requires, the willingness to sit inside complexity for months without forcing it to resolve. She was brought in to sit across from my team as a kind of parallel track. Her job was ostensibly to work on client-facing strategy development, while my team handled the internal revenue modeling. In theory, we were complementary. In reality, from the very first week, I noticed something. Vanessa asked questions that were just slightly too specific. Not curious questions, not learning questions, questions that felt like they were oriented around something she was trying to locate. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. We were in a Tuesday sync meeting, just the two of us and my senior analyst, a brilliant woman named Tori Weston, who had been with me for 3 years and could spot a pattern in a dataset the way some people spot faces in a crowd. Tori and I had been working for several months on what we internally called the Meridian model. No, actually, let me use the name we used internally at the time. We called it the layered revenue filter. It was a proprietary analytical framework I had spent the better part of a year developing. The short version is that most financial consulting firms look at revenue performance in fairly linear ways. My model layered in behavioral triggers, contractual timing anomalies, and what I called invisible drag, costs and revenue losses that don't appear clearly on any single report, but that compound invisibly across quarters. The layered revenue filter had already quietly saved 2 of our major clients somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million collectively in its first year of application. Richard knew about the results. He didn't fully understand the mechanism, which I'll come back to, but he knew the outcomes were exceptional. Vanessa knew the outcomes too. That January morning, she asked me very casually whether our models were built primarily in Excel or whether we used proprietary software. A reasonable question on the surface, but the way she asked it, with that slight pause before the word proprietary, told me she was looking for something more specific. I gave her a vague answer, something about a combination of tools, and I watched her file that away behind a smile. That night, I went home and I made a decision. I didn't make it out of paranoia. I made it out of pattern recognition, because I had seen this before. Not at this company, not with this person, but I had seen the specific shape of someone slowly orienting themselves around your work, like they're calculating the angle of approach. I called Tori that evening and I told her we needed to have a very particular conversation about our documentation practices going forward. What I did over the next 4 months, I want to be precise about because it matters for understanding what happened in that boardroom. I did not sabotage anything. I did not fabricate errors. I did not do anything that put a client at risk or compromised the integrity of the firm's work. What I did was architectural. Tori and I restructured how the layered revenue filter was documented internally. The real model, the fully functional version, lived in a secure partition of our project server that required dual authentication and that I had flagged as a restricted access resource. Only Tori and I had full access. What I created alongside it was a version of the documentation that looked complete, thoroughly detailed, professionally formatted. It had all the right terminology, all the right section headers, all the visual architecture of a working framework. But it was missing one critical element, the revenue filter sequence, which was a 7-step conditional logic chain that was essentially the engine of the entire model. Without that sequence, the framework would produce outputs that looked reasonable on the surface, but would begin compounding errors over time in ways that weren't immediately visible. I hid the filter sequence in a separate file, an unmarked one, embedded inside a folder labeled with an internal project code that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't built the system from scratch. And then I made the incomplete documentation slightly more accessible than it should have been. Not dramatically so, not in a way that looked intentional, but accessible enough that someone who was specifically looking for it and willing to go places they weren't supposed to go could find it. I told Tori exactly what I had done and why. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You think she's going to try to take this?" I said, "I think she's going to try to present this as something she developed, and when she does, I want there to be exactly one question that exposes it." Tori nodded slowly. Then she said, "How long do you think it'll take?" I said I thought we had about 3 months before Vanessa made her move. It took 4. The months between my conversation with Tori and the board presentation were, professionally, some of the most surreal of my career. Vanessa became increasingly friendly with me during that period, genuinely warm in a way that, under different circumstances, I might have appreciated. She would stop by my office with coffee sometimes. She started CCing me on emails in ways that felt collegial. She invited me to a lunch with 2 of the firm's junior partners, framing it as a chance to cross-pollinate ideas. I went. I was pleasant. I shared just enough to appear open without sharing anything that mattered. Meanwhile, I watched her access patterns on the shared server with the help of our IT administrator, a meticulous and deeply principled man named Oliver Fitch, who had been with the company for 9 years and who had no patience whatsoever for what he called people who mistake access for ownership. Oliver didn't know the full picture of what I had set up, but I had asked him a simple favor: to let me know if anyone outside my team accessed certain files on the restricted project server. I framed it as a security audit concern, which wasn't entirely untrue. In early April, Oliver sent me a brief email. No subject line, just 2 sentences. "The files you flagged were accessed on April 3rd at 11:47 p.m. Access originated from a device registered to V. Holloway." I read that email 3 times. Then I saved it, closed my laptop, and went to make tea. The thing about being right about something like this is that it doesn't feel satisfying right away. It feels clarifying, like a fog lifting that you had gotten so used to you stopped noticing it. I now knew 3 things with certainty. First, Vanessa had accessed documentation she had no authorization to access. Second, she had done it at almost midnight, which told me something about the relationship between her ambition and her judgment. And third, she had almost certainly found the incomplete version of the framework, the one without the revenue filter sequence, which meant that somewhere in the weeks ahead, she was going to build a presentation around a broken model and have no idea it was broken. I went back to work the next morning and said nothing to anyone except Tori. The board presentation was scheduled for mid-May as part of the firm's biannual strategic review. These presentations were significant events. All senior leadership, the full board, several major client representatives. They were the moments where careers accelerated or stalled. I had been preparing my own presentation, a genuine one, built on 18 months of refined work, real client outcomes, and the full functioning version of the layered revenue filter. It was the most comprehensive piece of analysis I had ever assembled. 2 weeks before the presentation date, Richard Holloway called me into his office. He was cordial, the way powerful people can be cordial when they've already made a decision and they're delivering it with a veneer of consultation. He told me that given the firm's desire to showcase emerging leadership, the strategic revenue segment of the board presentation would be led by Vanessa. He said my team's work would, of course, be represented. He said it was an opportunity to elevate new voices. I sat across from him and I held his gaze, and I said, "Of course, I support the decision completely." He looked slightly surprised, I think, that I didn't push back. Maybe he had prepared for a negotiation. What he got instead was a woman who smiled evenly and asked if there was anything she could do to support Vanessa's preparation. He said no, that Vanessa had it well in hand. I said I was glad to hear it. And then I went back to my office, closed the door, and sent Tori a 2-word message. It's time. What I did in the 2 weeks before that board meeting was make absolutely sure that every piece of real, complete, verified documentation of the layered revenue filter, including the full revenue filter sequence with all 7 conditional logic steps, was timestamped, archived, and accessible through 3 separate secure channels. I had printed copies, I had version-controlled digital files, I had a folder of client communications that referenced the model by name, with dates going back 14 months, and I had Oliver Fitch's email. I brought all of it to the board meeting in a single leather portfolio that I set on the table in front of me when I sat down. Nobody asked about it. Nobody paid any attention to it at all. All eyes were on Vanessa. She was good, I'll give her that. Vanessa opened with the firm's overall revenue trajectory and positioned herself as someone who had been conducting a quiet internal audit of the firm's analytical frameworks. She used that phrase, quiet internal audit, with a kind of gravitas that made several board members nod appreciatively. She then moved into the layered revenue filter. She called it the Holloway Strategic Revenue Architecture. She had given it a new name. For about 15 minutes, she presented the framework accurately because the incomplete documentation I had left accessible was accurate in its broad structure. She walked through the conceptual layers with confidence. She showed the client outcomes, the $11 million in identified savings, and she framed them as evidence of what this firm is capable of when strategy is properly executed. Then she got to the part that I had been waiting for. She described what she called a series of analytical errors in the original framework. She said the model, as previously implemented, contained critical miscalculations in the conditional output sequence that she had identified and corrected. She had slides for this, clean, professional slides with red highlights showing what she characterized as flaws. What those slides actually showed were the gaps created by the missing revenue filter sequence, the 7 steps I had deliberately kept out of the incomplete documentation. She had found the gaps, she just had no idea why they existed. And in the most remarkable move of the entire presentation, she had attempted to fill those gaps herself, and the fill she had constructed was plausible-looking but fundamentally incorrect. It would produce clean outputs for about 2 quarters before the compounding error effect would make itself devastatingly visible. I watched the board absorb all of this. I watched Richard watch his niece with visible pride. I watched 3 board members exchange glances that said, "This is impressive," and I sat completely still with my hands folded on the table. When Vanessa finished, the applause started. It built. 3 people stood. She looked briefly in my direction. It was a complicated look, something between triumph and an apology that she hadn't fully committed to feeling. I didn't react. The board chair, a measured man named Howard Kellner, thanked Vanessa and noted that the board would formally discuss the Director of Revenue Intelligence role, my role, in light of this impressive demonstration of strategic leadership. That was the moment they handed her my position, in not those words, but in every real sense. Then Howard asked if there were any questions before they moved to the next agenda item. I raised my finger. "I have one question," I said. The room settled. Vanessa was gathering her notes. She looked up. "In the corrected output sequence you presented, specifically in the conditional logic that you've revised in steps 4 through 7, what revenue filter were you applying to the cross-quarter drag calculation?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. For anyone unfamiliar with the technical context, that question sounds specific but not necessarily lethal. For anyone who had actually built or thoroughly understood the layered revenue filter, which was exactly 2 people in that room, both of whom were on my team, It was the most precise question possible, because the revenue filter sequence, the real one, had been accidentally deleted from the incomplete documentation when Vanessa had made her own attempted fix, which meant that even the incomplete version was no longer fully intact. Vanessa looked at me. She looked at her slides. She looked at her notes. The cross-quarter drag calculation, she repeated carefully, uses a weighted, specifically the filter, I said, still calm, still quiet, the 7-step conditional logic that governs the drag identification threshold. What values did you use in steps 4 and 5? Another silence, longer this time. Richard Holloway was looking at his niece. His face had shifted. Color was leaving it in real time, the way color leaves a room when a cloud passes over the sun. Because Richard Holloway had approved this presentation, he had positioned Vanessa as the architect of a strategic framework. He had been present for the client meetings where the real outcomes of this model had been reported. He knew enough to understand that the question I was asking was not a minor technical clarification. Vanessa set down her notes. "I'd need to pull up the full documentation to give you the precise values," she said. Of course, that makes sense, especially since the filter sequence file was accessed from your device at 11:47 p.m. on April 3rd and appears to have been modified in the version you worked from. Oliver, would you be able to speak to that? Oliver Fitch, who was seated against the wall in the section reserved for department support staff, looked up with the expression of a man who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. He nodded. "I have the access log here if the board would like to review it," he said. Howard Kellner looked at Richard. Richard Holloway looked at me, and I opened my leather portfolio. What happened in the next hour was not dramatic in the way that movies make things dramatic. Nobody shouted, nobody stormed out, Richard Holloway didn't confess to anything, and Vanessa Holloway didn't crumble. What happened was methodical and, in its own way, more devastating for being so calm. I walked the board through the complete documentation of the layered revenue filter, the real version time-stamped 14 months prior. I walked them through the architectural difference between what I had built and what Vanessa had presented. I showed them, using Vanessa's own slides as a reference point, exactly where the corrected sequence would fail and at what projected cost to client outcomes. I presented Oliver's access logs. I presented 14 months of client communications referencing the framework by its original internal name. I presented the version control history that showed unambiguously the sequence of modifications made to the file Vanessa had accessed. I didn't use the word stolen, I didn't use the word fraud, I didn't make a single accusation. I just presented information and answered questions. Howard Kellner called a brief recess at one point. During that recess, I sat at the table and reorganized my portfolio. Tori, who had been sitting against the same wall as Oliver, walked over and put a hand briefly on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. When the board reconvened, Howard Kellner addressed Richard Holloway directly. He said that the board would need to revisit the morning's personnel decisions pending a full review of the documentation presented. Richard said he understood. He didn't look at Vanessa when he said it. Vanessa left the room during the second recess. I don't know what was said between her and her uncle in the weeks that followed. I wasn't in those conversations, and I didn't try to be. What I do know is that she resigned from Holloway and Crane 6 weeks after the board meeting. The official announcement described it as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. My position was formally confirmed 2 weeks after the board meeting, with a salary adjustment that brought my compensation in line with what the role had apparently been underpaying me relative to market rate for the past 2 years. Howard Kellner mentioned that in our private conversation, as though he was surprised by the discrepancy. I was not surprised. People ask me sometimes, friends, colleagues, even Tori, whether what I did was ruthless, whether I had set a trap for someone and waited for them to walk into it. And my honest answer is that I think those words carry implications that don't quite fit what actually happened. I didn't create the situation. I didn't put opportunity in Vanessa Holloway's path and wait for her greed to respond to it. What I did was recognize a pattern that was already in motion and make a deliberate choice about how to respond to it. I could have confronted Vanessa directly. I could have gone to Richard early. I could have locked everything down so tightly that the entire situation never came to a head. But I had been in enough rooms to know how those responses play out when someone has a structural power advantage over you. When the person you're reporting the problem to is also the person who hired the problem. What I built was a situation where the truth could reveal itself in a room full of witnesses, with documentation that was impossible to refute, at a moment when ambiguity had been completely removed. That's not a trap. That's architecture. My father used to say that the floor manager gets the complaint and the executive gets the bonus. He said it as a fact of life. What he never said, what I figured out on my own, is that the floor manager doesn't have to accept that arrangement as permanent. Sometimes you just have to understand the building well enough to know exactly which door is going to open next, and then you make sure you're the one holding the key. If this story connected with something you've experienced or something you're navigating right now, this channel exists for exactly that. Stories about the moments that define us, the quiet decisions, the long patience, the single question that changes everything. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are more stories like this, and they're worth your time.